This channel is part of the History Hit network.
For almost 200 years, from 1096 until the end of the 13th century, a steel tide of knights, pilgrims and men-at-arms surged from Western Europe to the burning deserts of Palestine. They carried before them the cross of Christ and marched to liberate the most sacred city of the medieval world, Jerusalem. The desperate wars which followed would witness perhaps the most savage, bloody and fanatical conflict of the entire grim medieval age. The scorched desert sands of the Holy Land would be forever stained by the blood of Christian and Muslim. Their cause was holy war, and their struggles would become known to history as the Crusades. Although the crusading movement did not finally die out until well into the 16th century, its main successes occurred at its inception, late in the 11th century. This perhaps reflects the huge initial fervor of the people of Western Europe in response to calls for expeditions to the Middle East. The motivation of the individual participants in these and subsequent other expeditions, the so-called Crusades, remains largely a matter for speculation. There is no doubt that many were driven by a genuine spiritual desire to rescue the Holy Lands from the infidel. However, it is certain that more pragmatic motives, such as lust for plunder in the mystic and fabled cities of the East, had influence on many. Also, surprisingly, by the 11th century, many areas of Western Europe, especially those of urban development, had, by relative standards, become overpopulated and overcrowded. Many, therefore, saw the Crusades as an opportunity to gain landed wealth in captured enemy territories, although it is probable that most sought merely to escape the poverty, malnutrition and plague, as well as the sheer boredom and monotony of life in the medieval feudal hierarchy. But no matter what their reasons, it is a fact that hundreds of thousands of individuals left behind their homes and families to fight in this new kind of war. Whether they died in battle or as a result of wounds, disease, or simply starvation and exhaustion on the march, most crusaders never returned. In the second half of the 11th century, Palestine held a special status in the Middle East. For centuries, Muslims, Christians and Jews had lived there in comparative peace. It was both a holy land and a link between the Western world and the East. Although it had been governed by Muslims since the 7th century, Christians had become used to making pilgrimages there. The journey was long and dangerous, but the Fatimid rulers of Syria and Palestine were sympathetic. They offered Christian pilgrims food, protection, and the opportunity to trade. But in 1071, Seljuk Turks, who were nomadic warriors from Central Asia, defeated the Byzantine army at Manzikert. These men were fanatical converts to Islam, with a reputation for savagery quite unlike the Fatimids. Within 7 years, they had swept through Asia Minor and seized control of the Middle East, including the ports of Damascus, Antioch, and, most importantly, Jerusalem.
History Hit is like Netflix, just for history fans, with exclusive history documentaries covering some of the most famous people and events in history just for you. With familiar faces such as Dan Jones and Dr. Eleanor Yanega, we've got hundreds of documentaries covering the greatest figures and events of medieval history. We're committed to bringing history fans award-winning documentaries and podcasts that you cannot find anywhere else. Sign up now for a free trial, and Chronicle fans get 50% off their first 3 months. Just be sure to use the code Chronicle at checkout.
Now, under the Seljuk rule, Christian pilgrims were commonly turned away from the Middle East. Many were attacked, robbed and killed by the Turks as the land routes to Syria and Palestine were closed. Trade to the close western nations was immediately threatened by Turkish privateers. Before long, the Byzantine Emperor Alexius I Comnenus, who had lost vast provinces to the Turks, appealed to the West for help in regaining them. The reaction in the West was, by modern standards, extraordinarily slow. But over a period of a decade, as the reality of Turkish rule in the East became established, momentum grew behind a movement to act. In the winter of the year 1095, Pope Urban II addressed the people of France. In a field outside the town of Clermont, he appealed to the nobles and clergymen of Christendom to embark on an armed pilgrimage to the East. He offered the protection of the Church to all those who took part. In the following year, he toured France with this message, and where he could not appear personally, his words were read to the people. Pope Urban, servant of the servants of God, to all the faithful waiting in Flanders, both rulers and subjects, greetings, grace, and apostolic blessing. We know you have already heard from the testimony of many that the frenzy of the barbarians has devastated the churches of God in the East, and has even, shame to say, seized into slavery the holy city of Christ, Jerusalem. Grieving in pious contemplation of this disaster, we visited France and strongly urged the princes and people of that land to work for the liberation of the Eastern Church. At the Council of Auvergne, we enjoined on them this undertaking for the remission of all their sins, and appointed our dear son Adhemar, Bishop of Le Puy, as leader of the journey on our behalf, so that whoever should set out on such a journey should obey his orders as if they were our own. If God calls any of you to this task, know that the Bishop Adhemar will set out with the aid of God on the 15th of August, 1096, the feast of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin. What the Pope intended was an expedition to recover the Holy Land from the infidels, and by guaranteeing the blessing and protection of the Church, he offered an irresistible reward of both material and spiritual advancement. In other words, booty with God's blessing. The Pope signalled the way to the Holy Land in no uncertain terms. Here you are poor and unhappy. There you will be joyful and prosperous and true friends of God.
A great commotion arose through all the regions of France, so that if anyone earnestly wished to follow God with pure heart and mind, and wanted to bear the cross faithfully after him, he would hasten to take the road to the Holy Sepulchre. For Pope Urban II began to deliver eloquent sermons and to preach, saying that if anyone wished to save his soul, he should not hesitate to undertake with humble spirit the way of the Lord. And if he were in want of money, divine mercy would provide for him. For His Holiness the Pope said, "Brothers, you must suffer many things in the name of Christ. Wretchedness, poverty, nakedness, persecution, need, sickness, hunger, thirst, and other privations of this kind, just as the Lord said to his disciples, you must suffer many things in my name." The great warrior Bohemond of Toronto, hearing that an immense army of Christians was on its way to the Holy Land, asked what weapons this army was carrying. He was told respectively, "They carry weapons suited for war. They bear the cross of Christ. And with one voice they cry out the words, 'God wills it! God wills it! God wills it!'"
The Byzantine emperor had hoped to recruit a mercenary army to fight the Turks. Instead, the Pope's clarion call unleashed upon the East the First Crusade. The Pope delivered his message to the nobility of Europe personally. But the Crusade would rely on ordinary people as much as the clergy and nobility. In each land, the call to arms was heard by the poor, oppressed and discontented from their own fanatical preachers. Guibert, abbot of Nogent, wrote of one such man who incited about him the people of northern France. While all the princes who required large funds and great retinues of supporters were arranging their affairs in an organized and scrupulous fashion before they left for the Holy Land, the common people, who were poor in possessions but rich in numbers, attached themselves to a certain Peter the Hermit. Unless I am mistaken, he came from the city of Amiens in France, and had led the solitary life, wearing a monk's habit, in some part of northern France, I do not know where. He left, for what purpose I do not know, and travelled through cities and towns to preach. He was surrounded by such throngs of people, given such gifts, acclaimed as such an example of holiness, that I remember no one ever having been held in such honour. Peasants, criminals, craftsmen, beggars, the old and the infirm were fired by religious fervour and the prospect of loot and pillage. The People's Crusade, a motley army led by Peter the Hermit, left Cologne in April 1096. Its impatience is perhaps related by Guibert, who noted that as soon as they came to some walled town, they would ask repeatedly if this was Jerusalem. The main armies of the Crusade did not leave until the summer. They needed time to prepare, train and organize the wagons, horses and weapons needed. Across Europe, noblemen mortgaged their possessions in order to pay for provisions for the journey. The Church encouraged these knights to place their land in its keeping for the duration of the crusade. In this way, it soon amassed vast wealth. Godfrey of Bouillon, who commanded one of the 4 largest armies, sold his castle and land in northern France outright. His landless brother Baldwin eagerly joined him, thereby escaping the dull prospect of training for a life in the clergy. Count Raymond of Toulouse, almost 60 years old, commanded the most powerful army. This consisted mainly of southern Frenchmen. With him rode the bishop Le Puy, whom the Pope had appointed spiritual leader of the crusade. A force of men from Normandy, England and Scotland was led jointly by Count Robert of Flanders, Stephen, Count of Blois and Chartres, Count Hugh of Vermandois, the French king's brother, and Duke Robert of Normandy, the son of William the Conqueror. The other great army was made up of Normans who had previously conquered and settled in southern Italy, led by Bohemond of Taranto. It was agreed that the Crusaders should meet in Constantinople. There, the Byzantine emperor would supply ships to take them over the Bosphorus into Asia. But the long march of so many armies across Europe was not an easy one. Discipline and planning was essential for such a complicated logistical operation, and in many cases this was badly lacking. Peter the Hermit's People's Crusade, now numbering 20,000 people, frequently lost all cohesion, and on many occasions his pilgrims ran amok. In the town of Semlin, where a small group of crusaders had already been punished for raiding a bazaar, Peter's crusaders slaughtered 4,000 people before proceeding into Byzantium, plundering as they went. Belgrade was burned, and the Bulgarian governor sent his army against them. Thousands of men, women and children died. When at last Peter and the remnants of his crusader army reached Constantinople, they began, at once, to ransack it. The emperor quickly transported them across the Bosphorus. Anna Komnena, daughter of the Byzantine emperor, recorded how the People's Crusade met its end. At the news of plunder and money, they immediately set off along the road to Nicaea, with no semblance of order, all forgetting their military skill and the discipline required of those going out to battle. The race of Latins is generally noted for its love of money, but when it embarks on the invasion of a country, then it becomes totally unbridled, devoid of all reason. Since these men were advancing in no sort of order or discipline, they fell into the Turkish ambush near Drakon and were miserably wiped out. In autumn, the French and English armies made their way across the Alps. They had to contend with snow, local traffic on the old Roman roads, and the problem of bandits. Count Raymond in particular suffered greatly from such attacks when he forced his way down the boggy Dalmatian coast, presenting an easy target for the Slavs. Because of this, his food supplies were exhausted before he reached Constantinople. Once over the Alps, the great army split up into independent commands which sailed separately across the Adriatic. Both halves of the force suffered losses at sea in the primitive merchant ships they employed. Prince Bohemond's army crossed from Bari to Greece, but in the Pindus Mountains they lost their pack animals and had to ransack the countryside for more. For the rest of the journey to Constantinople, the emperor put them under a guard of mercenaries who, themselves, did not at all mind picking off and killing several straggling crusaders. By May 1097, between 60,000 and 100,000 men had crossed into Asia, and the campaign proper began. The Crusaders never had any overall commander or plans. They simply launched an attack on Nicaea, the Turkish capital. Stephen of Blois, the son of William the Conqueror, wrote of the attack to his wife. "Nicaea, my love, is surrounded by more than 300 towers, with the most amazing walls. We found the Turks inside the city bold fighters, for we discovered that the boundless army of God had already locked in mortal combat with the people of Nicaea for 4 weeks. The Crusaders settled down to a 7-week siege of the city. Yet the day before their planned assault, the Byzantine Emperor Alexius attacked by sea and forced the surrender of the garrison. Though rewarded well, the Crusaders felt cheated of plunder and unhappy about the manner of their victory. The way to Anatolia was now open. As Stephen of Blois recorded, God triumphed and great Nicaea was won back on 19th of June 1097. I am telling you this, my love, since we will reach Jerusalem from Nicaea in 5 weeks, if Antioch does not get in our way. Unfortunately, Stephen of Blois' optimism was misplaced. It would in fact take 2 years to reach Jerusalem. In July, half the Crusader army was ambushed by Sultan Kilij Arslan, but withstood attack long enough for the situation to be reversed when the rest of the Crusaders in turn rode upon the Sultan's men and broke them. Morale soon rose amongst the Crusaders as one remembered. We pursued and killed them throughout the day and took much spoil, gold and silver, horses and asses, camels, sheep and oxen. The Christian armies pushed on, making an exhausting 4-month journey across the desert to Antioch, capital of Syria. By its end, in October, many of the horses and animals were dead, and those knights on foot had dispensed with their heavy armour. There, the Crusaders lay siege to the ancient Roman fort. But through spies and traitors, word reached the Turks of the Crusaders' depleted strength and lack of supplies. The Emir of Mogul attacked. The weary, exhausted foot soldiers and only 1,000 mounted knights fought off this attack and were shortly after relieved, just in time, by the arrival of Genoese supply ships. Before the Emir could launch a second attack, however, the Crusaders gained entry to Antioch by stealth. Having scaled the walls just before dawn, aided by a Turk traitor, 60 Crusaders succeeded in opening the gates from within. By the end of that June day in 1098, every Turk in Antioch was dead. The Emir, in turn, now lay siege to the Christians. As the Crusaders began to starve, Emperor Alexius began to march to their rescue. But he soon turned back, believing that the Crusaders had been defeated, already frustrated by repeated betrayals and deceits by the Byzantines. The Crusaders never forgot or forgave him for this act of abandonment. Just as all hope seemed in vain, fate interceded on behalf of the Crusaders. A peasant crusader claimed to have a vision of St. Andrew, telling him where the Holy Lance was buried, and a piece of metal, believed to be a lance, which was said to have pierced the side of Christ on the cross, was found. This discovery spurred the Crusaders into a religious frenzy, which was so great that they were able to march out of Antioch, scattering the Emir's men before them and averting defeat. After taking the walled town of Marat and Numan, the Crusaders progressed along the coast, quickly taking Tripoli, Tyre and Acre, before turning inland to Bethlehem. There, siege weapons were built, and after 5 weeks, the assault on Jerusalem was made. The north wall was soon breached, and under a hail of rocks, stones and burning oil, Godfrey's men were the first to climb into the city. The gates were opened, and 1,300 knights and 10,000 infantry flooded into the streets. It was almost 4 years since Pope Urban's appeal for the expedition, and now the Crusaders had finally reached their objective. Jerusalem was once more in Christian hands. But the human price was terrible. For 3 whole days and nights, the Crusaders ran amok, killing men, women and children. One English crusader, named Roger de Busley, bore witness to the siege and its aftermath.
Before we attacked Jerusalem, the bishops and priests preached to us, telling us to go in a procession in God's honour around Jerusalem and pray and give alms and fast. On Friday, the 15th of July, 1099, early in the morning we attacked the city from all sides, but can make no headway against it. We were all numb with astonishment and very frightened. Godfrey of Bouillon and his brother Baldwin, Count of Boulogne, were fighting bravely in the siege tower. And then one of our knights, Lethal by name, climbed up to the walls of the city. As soon as he had climbed it, all the defenders of the city fled along the walls and through the city. Our men, following Lethal, chased after them, killing and dismembering them as far as the Temple of Solomon. And in that place, there was such slaughter that we were up to our ankles in their blood.
Godfrey of Bouillon, in fact, was honoured with the title of Defender of the Holy Sepulchre. A month later, in August, the Crusaders attacked and defeated the Egyptian army on a plain north of Ascalon. After this, the Holy Land was truly theirs. The Christian forces participating in the Crusades were composed of differing nationalities, and so are often referred to as the Frankish or Latin armies. Moreover, they were composed of varied social ranks and standings. As with all European armies of the medieval period, the Crusades were organized according to the dictates of the feudal system. A king granted lands to his barons and the church, and in return received fixed quotas of knights for military service in times of war. In turn, the nobles and clergy sublet lands in return for a military contingent from each estate. Each knight, or subtenant, provided not only himself as an armoured cavalryman, but perhaps also brothers or other kinsmen as mounted sergeants or squires. His freehold tenants were equipped to a reasonably high standard with basic padded or mail armour and swords or polearms as men-at-arms. In addition, extra peasants were kept for labour and to serve as basic infantry. In this way, the feudal retinue of a kingdom's baronage and church combined to form national armies. Finally, forces of hired mercenaries served to stiffen an assembled army. It is difficult to estimate the actual size of the Crusader armies due to the exaggerations of contemporary chroniclers. However, it is probable that the great army of the First Crusade numbered around 150,000, almost certainly including large numbers of camp followers, women, sutlers, and peasants. The contingent led by Raymond of Toulouse is known to be the largest, comprising around 1,200 cavalry and 8,500 infantry. Similarly, in the Middle East, armies were also organised along the lines of a feudal system. The forces, known collectively as Saracens, were composed mainly of Fatimid, Abbasid, and Seljuk Turk peoples. In general, each province of an individual caliphate had, by law, to finance its own contingent of the national army. An emir was placed in charge of levying such a force, and along with an annual tribute to the Sultan, was required in wartime to provide a set number of troops. Saracen armies, therefore, consisted of a large professional force provided by the Sultan's personal bodyguard, together with the feudal troops of the emirs. In addition, each emir usually had his own personal bodyguard of professional soldiers, known as askars. In general, both Saracen infantry and cavalry were lighter armoured than their Christian foes, though still frequently being equipped with mail shirts and helmets. Favoured weapons included the curved scimitar and the wide-bladed falchion, along with the universally common war axe. As with the Christian armies, Saracen forces were frequently strengthened with units of mercenaries, mainly comprising Turkoman-mounted archers. Still less is known about the numerical strength of Saracen armies, although early in the 12th century, the Caliph of Baghdad could muster an army of some 120,000 cavalry alone. The major tactical arm of the Crusader forces was the heavily armoured mounted knight, wearing a padded gambeson beneath a mail shirt, along with a great or barrel helm, shield and lance or mace. Mounted on large horses and charging in a concentrated mass, such troops had little difficulty in scattering the much lighter armed and horsed Saracen cavalry. In response, the Arab horsemen could only melt away before a charge, hoping to inflict missile casualties by means of the light composite bow they carried. Although both armies employed units of crossbowmen, the dominant age of the English longbow had not yet arrived, and so engagements were usually decided on the strength of cavalry tactics. Time and again throughout the conflicts, the heavily armoured Christian knights would pitch headlong into the often numerically superior but lighter armed Saracen cavalry and infantry units. In 1144, the Saracen chief Imad ad-Din Zangi broke into the city of Edessa and massacred the inhabitants. It was the first serious challenge to the Crusaders' states which had been established in the Holy Land. Until then, local alliances, particularly with the Muslim sect known as the Assassins, so called because of their use of the drug hashish, had enabled the Crusader kings to rule peacefully. This sudden intrusion was as unexpected as it was violent. Western Christendom was shaken, and the Pope's agent and adviser, St. Bernard of Clairvaux, called for a response. This took the form of the Second Crusade. It was led by Louis VII of France, who had for some time been planning an armed pilgrimage to the Holy Lands, and Conrad III of Germany. It proved to be a complete disaster. Conrad's army was simply defeated in battle and massacred by the Turks near Dorylaeum. There were only a few survivors who managed to reach Antioch. The French army, on the other hand, having set out for Edessa, made an inexplicable change of plan and, instead, turned to attack the Syrian city of Damascus. Damascus had been fought over many times, but despite strong links with its Christian inhabitants, it had never been held by the Crusaders. William of Tyre witnessed the attempt to take the city. At the height of the fighting, the citizens, amazed at the number and valour of our army, began to lose faith in their own power to resist. They barricaded with huge beams all the suburbs of the city and the area where our men were encamped. Their only hope being that while the Christians were engaged in breaking down these barriers, they themselves would be able to flee with their wives and children through the opposite area of the city, had divine favour been with us. But he who is terrible in his plans for the sons of men had decided otherwise. For while the citizens had packed their bags and decided to leave the place, they began to presume upon our cupidity and came up with the intention of storming with money the souls of those whose bodies they could not overcome by fighting. They used various arguments, even bringing a countless quantity of money, to persuade some of our leaders to play the part of the traitor Judas. Now these men, corrupted by gifts and promises, persuaded the kings and the pilgrim leaders, who trusted completely in their loyalty and industry, to transfer the army to the opposite side of the city. They claimed that on that side, looking south and east, there were no orchards to defend the city, nor was the access to the wall impeded by any moat or river. The kings and the leaders of the whole army believed them, and deserted the place which they had previously occupied with great effort and loss of men. They transferred their whole force, and under the traitor's direction, set up camp on the opposite side of the city. But when they realized that their new position was a long way from the water and lacked the abundance of fruit of the previous one, and that their supplies had now almost failed, they complained too late that there had been treachery.
A severe shortage of food was beginning to set in, for the soldiers had been led to believe before they set out that the city would be taken very quickly, and so had only brought a few days' supplies with them. This was especially the case with those new to the Holy Land. They became doubtful and wondered what they should do. It seemed hard, if not impossible, to return to the position they had deserted. Therefore, the pilgrim leaders held council together, and they decided to return home. The kings and leaders were themselves confused and afraid, and their business, unaccomplished because of our sins, were forced to leave.
After 4 days encamped outside the city, the French army was forced to retreat from repeated Damascus counterattacks, and the Second Crusade fell into disorder.
The men returned to their own kingdoms by the same route as they had come, and held in suspicion all the ways of our princes, rightly declining to take any part in their plans. The result of this was that thereafter pilgrims coming this way were neither so many nor so ardent, and even today those who do come do not want to fall into the net of treachery, and so seek to return home quickly.
The Second Crusade ended in 1149, leaving Crusader power in the region weakened and internally fractured by power struggles. In the following years, Christian leaders squabbled over authority in the Holy Land, while Damascus actually fell to Nureddin, the son of Zangi. Against this background, a new threat surfaced. After Nureddin's death in 1174, a Kurdish commander called Saladin took Damascus. By 1176, he was the ruler of all Egypt and able to set about the control of all Muslim lands bordering the Crusader states by means of truces and the clever division of his enemies. In this way, this clever and able soldier was able to focus all his attention upon Jerusalem and his holy war against the Crusaders.
God, may he be exalted. And as for those who fight for us, we guide them along our path. Indeed, God is on the side of those who do good. There are many texts on jihad in the Quran, and I have been extremely diligent in waging this holy war, and it was constantly on my mind. One could swear by one's right hand without fear of contradiction that from the time I first set out, intent on jihad, until the day I die, I have not spent a single gold or silver coin except on jihad and pious works. My heart and mind are so taken over by this burning zeal for jihad that I can think of nothing else. Out of my desire to fight for God's cause, I have left behind my family, children, country, home, and all the town under my control. For I am Saladin. God is my Lord.
Having captured all the coastal towns but Tyre, Antioch, and Tripoli, he at last invaded Galilee. Saladin's military genius would be confirmed just over a decade later. A single, crushing victory over the Christians would send fearful repercussions throughout Western Europe. In July 1187, Saladin's army of 100,000 men surrounded the Crusaders, 1,200 knights and 20,000 infantry, on a plain west of Tiberias, marked by two hills known as the Horns of Hattin.
I stayed up all that night of July 2nd, 1187, until I had positioned each company's detachment of front-rank archers and had filled their wooden and leather quivers with arrows. The number of arrows I distributed amounted to 400 loads. not counting the supply carried by 70 dromedaries I had brought onto the battlefield, from which anyone could take a supply of arrows. As the day of 3rd July dawned, our archers emerged, setting alight the people of hell fire with a blaze of arrows. There was a creaking of bows and a plucking of strings on that day, and the army poured down on the Franks their scorching rays. As the heat flared up, the forces of evil began to fade. A searing thirst descended. The air burned as passions turned to fear. Those dogs, panting, their tongues lolling, plagued by a havoc of their own making, turned their minds to thoughts of water, only to be met by the flames of hell, and to be overcome by the fire of the midday sun.
One crusader who survived the engagement recorded his experiences. At the precise instant that the fighting began, Raymond III, Count of Tripoli, left the spot feigning flight. The rumour has it that he did this by pre-arrangement so that our troops should scatter, apparently stricken by terror at the desertion of one who should have been their support, while the spirits of the enemy were raised. So the Lord gave his people over also unto the sword, embroiled in conflict, consigning his inheritance to slaughter and pillage, as the sins of mankind demanded. The forces of Saladin indeed proved too strong for the Franks, who were finally driven up to the horns of Hattin themselves. Once surrounded, the defeat of the Crusader army was inevitable.
No matter how hard they fought, they were repulsed. No matter how often they rallied, each time they were encircled. Not even an ant crawled out from among them, nor could they defend themselves against the onslaught. They retreated to Mount Hattin to escape the storm of destruction, but on Hattin itself, they found themselves encumbered by fatal thunderbolts. Arrowheads transfixed them, the peaks laid them low. Bows pinned them down, fate tore at them, calamity chewed them up, and disaster tainted them. Not since the Frankish occupation of the Syrian coast had the Muslims' thirst for victory been quenched to the extent it was on the day of Hattin, 4th July, 1187. God, may he be honored and glorified, gave the upper hand to me, Saladin, and enabled me to perform that in which kings had proved themselves deficient.
Saladin's victory was crushing, and Crusader losses indeed heavy. So many were slain, so many wounded, and so many thrown into chains, that our people completely defeated were a pitiable sight even to the enemy. Worse still, the cross of our salvation, that life-giving wood, was taken into the hands of the enemy, and along with it fell its bearers, the Bishop of Acre and the defender of the Holy Sepulchre. One killed, the other captured. When the noise of battle had ceased, and Saladin beheld the captives being dragged away and the dead strewn about, he raised his eyes to heaven and thanked his God for the victory. He even claimed that it was our wickedness, not his power, gave him his victory, and the turn of events bore him out. For our arm, however small, generally prevailed with God's help. On this occasion, however, we were not with the Lord, nor he with us, and our troops were utterly worsted, although they were reckoned to be no more than 20,000 of the Saracens. The Christian army was hacked to pieces. After the battle, Saladin displayed his renowned generosity by sparing many of the prisoners for ransom. Indeed, Saladin's capacity for mercy and magnanimity in victory is well documented among Christian and Muslim accounts alike.
Once, during the siege of Jerusalem, an army scout came to us with a sobbing woman beating her breast. She came from the Frankish garrison, the scout explained, and wishes to see you, my master. We brought her here. I questioned her. She said, yesterday some Muslim thieves entered my tent and stole my little girl. I cried all night, and our commands told me, the king of the Muslims is merciful. We'll let you go to him, and you can ask for your daughter back. Thus I have come, and I place all my hopes in you. I was moved. Tears came to my eyes. I sent to the slave market for the girl to be found, and in less than an hour's passing, a horseman arrived bearing the child on his shoulders. As soon as she saw them, the girl's mother threw herself to the ground and smeared her face with sand. All those present wept with emotion. She looked heavenward and prayed with relief and thanksgiving. Thus was her daughter returned to her, and she was escorted back to the camp of the Franks. The tears of Saladin.
However, all the captured Templars and Hospitallers were executed. By October, Saladin had captured Jerusalem, and once more the Western world was thrown into panic. In 1190, the Third Crusade was launched. This time, the feverishly raised expedition east comprised French, English, German and Scandinavian troops. The German troops were led by their now almost 70-year-old Emperor Frederick I Barbarossa. It was his misfortune to march overland towards Constantinople, only to drown in an Armenian river. The English and French travelled by sea, but spent much time at ports of call such as Sicily on the way, and in dealing with disease among their troops. As a result, they did not reach Palestine until 1191. The French king, Philip Augustus, and the English king Richard the Lionheart quarrelled persistently with each other, even as they landed and began to pillage their way eastward. The contrast of character between the two leaders was marked. Philip of France was known to be sickly, nervous, cunning and cruel, and relied heavily on duplicity to achieve his political ends. Richard of England was a naturally charismatic personality, and, though he was as cruel as Philip, he was rash, dashing and inspirational. By July, however, the Crusaders succeeded in ending Saladin's 2-year siege of the port of Acre and marched into the city. The Saracen army's supply route was then cut off by Italian warships, which also prevented reinforcements from reaching the field, and the Crusaders set about ransoming Saracen prisoners. When this ransom payment failed to arrive on time, Richard had 2,700 Saracen prisoners executed. After 2 weeks, Philip Augustus returned to France, markedly depleting the Crusaders' strength. Despite this, Richard characteristically confronted Saladin's forces in battle not far from Jaffa, on the plain of Arsuf, a site of great strategic importance. With the sea at their flank, Richard's heavily armoured troops strongly resisted the hail of Saracen arrows before unleashing their deadly ace, the charge of heavy cavalry, to great effect. Although with such a depleted force, it was impossible to achieve a total victory, the Crusaders eventually won the day. One of Richard's veterans relates that, as the Christians kept up the slaughter, hammering away with their swords, the Turks began to panic and weaken. For some while the battle swayed to and fro, each side returning blow for blow and striving for victory. Some retreated, covered in blood. Others, though wounded, rushed on to their death. Many flags could be seen falling to earth with banners of all shapes and sizes and countless pennants and standards. Trusty swords lay scattered around, metal-tipped darts, Turkish bows and clubs bristling with sharp teeth. Over the battlefield, more than 20 cartloads of bolts, javelins, arrows and other missiles could have been collected. Great numbers of bearded Turks lay dead and mutilated. With a courage born of despair, others kept fighting, but as our forces gained ground, some were knocked from their horses and hid in the undergrowth, while others swarmed up trees only to be pierced by arrows, falling to earth with dreadful screams. Yet others left their horses of their own will and slipped away in flight by hazardous byways to the sea, where they hurled themselves into the deep from cliffs as much as 30 meters high. Thus the enemy was gloriously routed, so that for 2 miles nothing could be seen but a fleeing mob. They who had been so steadfast, so fierce, and so swollen with pride, by God's help, fell in their arrogance. Although Richard achieved victory over Saladin and fought on in Palestine for some time, he never succeeded in liberating the holy city of Jerusalem.
After one victory at Arsuf, with the guidance of the bon Dieu, we reached Jaffa on 29 September 1191 and fortified the city with ditches and a wall with the intention of protecting the interests of Christianity to the best of our ability. After his defeat, Saladin has not dared to face the Christians, but like a lion in his den has been secretly hiding and plotting to kill the friends of the cross like sheep for slaughter. So, when he heard that we were swiftly heading for Ascalon, he overthrew it and leveled it to the ground. Likewise, he has laid waste and trampled on the land of Syria. Therefore, we consider it grounds for good hope that soon, God willing, the inheritance of the Lord will be fully regained. Since, in its recovery, we have exhausted not only our money, but our strength and body as well. We bring it to the attention of your fraternal personage, that we certainly cannot remain in the country of Syria after Easter. Just as, at the beginning of this expedition, our people were encouraged to serve Almighty God, now too, there is a great need to firmly incite the same men to restore his holy inheritance, for it is forever too late.
Eventually, afflicted both by illness and by worrying news from home, where war had erupted between France and England, Richard reluctantly agreed a 3-year truce with Saladin. Safa al-Din, Saladin's brother and governor of the coastal area, negotiated peace on several terms. When these terms had been put into writing and read to Richard, he gave his consent. He could not hope for more, sick as he was, with little prospect of help, and not more than a couple of miles from the enemy lines. Anyone who maintains that any other reaction was possible in the matter of this treaty must incur the charge of dishonest thinking. Richard only intended a temporary truce. Indeed, he wanted to see his own land again and re-equip himself with men and money. Then he would return, he swore, and wrench Jerusalem from Saladin's grasp. Saladin sent back messages swearing that, by Almighty God and the Holy Law, he held Richard's integrity, pride and excellence in such high esteem that, if he had to lose his land in his lifetime, he would rather it were taken by one of such power and courage than by any other prince he had ever seen. In fact, the two men never met again. Saladin died in 1193, while Richard languished in a Vienna prison, a king held to ransom. After Saladin's death, the Saracen Empire crumbled. With the passing of these two unforgettable leaders, the days of the true Crusades ended. Moreover, the subsequent loss of Acre to the Turks caused Crusader power in Palestine to collapse irretrievably. Never again could Western Europe be rallied to the cross, now completely preoccupied with its own national wars and intrigues. Although attempts were made throughout the 14th and 15th centuries to curb the power of the mighty Ottoman Turks, none of these was to achieve any lasting success. But the dream of recapturing Jerusalem, the navel of the world, from the infidel, continued to haunt the minds of men. As late as 1492, the renowned explorer Christopher Columbus suggested that the riches of his new world might be used to set free the holy city. Today, almost 1,000 years later, it is easy to consign to history the Crusades as a litany of mankind's folly and horrid capacity for destruction and cruelty in the name of religion. Yet even today, the scourge of holy war lives on, a grim reminder of the sweat, blood, and undying faith of the wars of the cross.